Well, we want to welcome you. We're so delighted to be with everyone today to share this conversation as part of Tucson Nurses Week. And what we're going to be discussing is grieving and caring for yourself during COVID. And so we've designed this talk to begin with an introduction of the presenters so that you can learn a little bit about us. Then we're going to provide some foundational information that talks about what we're hearing from nurses, what are the struggles that people are experiencing right now. Then we'll look briefly at some of the literature and research and what it's showing in terms of burnout and the struggles that are very real. And then the primary portion of our dialogue today is actually a conversation. So we'll drop the slides and we're just going to dialogue with the four of us and have some heart-to-heart discussion about how we see and hear what is happening right now during this challenging time. And then we wanted to leave you with some really practical resources. So we're going to end our time today by sharing some resources that can support you in taking care of yourself. So that's the format that we'll be offering. And I am going to hand it over to David and Piper to introduce themselves.
Thank you so much, Shay. So I am Piper and I am from Casa de la Luz Hospice, Palliative Care and Bereavement. Casa has been serving the Tucson community for hospice for over 2 decades. And we deliver superior care. And then we moved into the community palliative care space, and our bereavement, 30% of our bereavement care is purely serving our community. So I'd like to introduce David Fife. He is the director of our social services. He is also the chair of our hospice bioethics committee, and he has been working with us since 2007. David?
Thank you. And that was our amazing administrator at Casa de la Luz, Piper Frisson. She's been a nurse for almost 30 years and has worked across the spectrum of care, from acute care to med surg. And you can see the other areas, but it's been a real gift to us to have that kind of experience along with her ability to lead the organization moving forward. So we're very happy to be with you all today.
Thank you, David. I'm gonna introduce Integrative Touch for Kids and another member of our group here today. So Integrative Touch for Kids, or ITK, has been a nonprofit around for going on almost 15 years now. And we serve children with special medical needs. We also serve their families. And we also serve the healthcare and the community support members around those families. And we work in a variety of different facilities, everything from inpatient to palliative care to community clinics and retreats and different innovative service models. And I am delighted to introduce you all to Shay Bider. She is the founder and executive director of Integrative Touch for Kids. And she's really paved the way for new forms of delivery for integrative care for children, families, and healthcare providers.
Thank you so much, Katie. We also love taking care of nurses. So all the nurses that are listening know that we've got your back. And I'm delighted to introduce our program director, Katie Frazee, who right now is doing a ton with telehealth programming that we're actually offering, which you'll learn about in this discussion, programs for nurses through telewellness. So now I want to go ahead and pivot to Piper, who's going to share about what we're hearing.
Thank you so much, Shay. So originally we started to have this conversation in 2019, planning for 2020's Nurses Week on caregiver moral distress. And then the pandemic hit. So now we see more and more moral distress within the healthcare community. So we really wanted to take this time to partner with our colleagues to give you tools, because what we're hearing is devastating. We're hearing moral distress about what's happening in the community, where healthcare workers don't feel that their sacrifices are being heard or seen. We're hearing moral distress about individuals and healthcare workers feeling that the standards of practice has changed or decreased in order to serve people, putting themselves at more risk. I think one of the things that disturbs me or concerns me is we're hearing a lot more self-medicating going on in the healthcare profession, either with alcohol or drugs to ease the stress, or shopping, which is one of my issues. But we're also hearing about there's just, how can I cope? There's so much death. There's so much isolation from my family, from my community. I don't know about y'all, but I miss going out and just sitting on a patio with my friends and having a wonderful taco and just finding out what's going on with them. And as I get older, one of the biggest concerns I have is hearing the statement, I've been a nurse for 1 year, 5 years, 30 years, and now I want to leave the profession. That really concerns me, both for us as a profession and a nation, but also as a nurse of almost 30 years. I don't want to see my profession dwindle away. I think overarching some of the statements that we hear that concern us, and the reason why we're having this discussion today, is I am tired. I am scared. I miss my kids, which just breaks my heart. I'm isolated, and I have to be strong, and I have to keep going.
Yeah, such heavy stuff there, right? Whew.
Yep.
I think that we have seen almost on a daily basis the statistics roll out about the number of COVID positive individuals within our community, the number of deaths that we've experienced. But we are just beginning to get our minds around the toll that has taken emotionally and spiritually on all of us as individuals and as a community. And we thought that it was important to put some of these statistics up for you, just to see the magnitude of our grief, the toll it's taken on us emotionally. When you look at 1.7 million Americans that lost a grandparent or parent, sibling, spouse, or child due to COVID, that there are 43,000, and the number is higher now, who have lost a parent. We are going to be dealing with the grief, the bereavement needs within our community and our nation for years to come. And it's important to lift that up so that we can begin to figure out what resources will be needed, what we need to do for one another, and how important organizations are that serve those needs within the community and how we can better resource them moving forward. It also speaks to the burnout that we are seeing within healthcare workers. You can look at the slide in front of you where roughly 3 in 10 healthcare workers have weighed leaving the profession. And Piper talked about that, is that people feeling like after they've had their whole career and they've endured a lot, that this has been an experience that they could not have prepared for. And that they maybe don't feel like we have the resources to respond to it. But it's so important that we raise awareness around this, because unless it's seen, unless we are talking about it, we will never address it. And then it also, I am sure that our clinicians, our nurses, and other practitioners feel the stress of, am I going to make a mistake when we are not at our best, when we are either in poor physical or mental health, that we know that we're more prone to making errors in our work, and that it is vital that we are able to support one another, and that our institutions are providing those structures so that we can be at our best, even in times of crisis, like that we have just experienced over this last year.
Wonderful. And now is really the opportunity for us to shift into the discussion portion. So we're going to go ahead and open it up with a series of questions and then really just dialogue amongst ourselves. So Piper is going to lead us in this effort and kick it off with our first question.
So I think our first question actually comes to just being in healthcare, but really speaks to where we are today with COVID coming or coming out of a pandemic. We're not quite there yet, but what has it been like to experience grief as a caregiver? And do you feel like you have the permission to grieve? And if not, why not? So this was one of David and my first conversations in 2019 is, you leave a room after a code or a death, and you go immediately into the next room with a smile on, how may I serve you? And do we take a breath to really recognize and grieve in that moment? And then we get home and we become a mom, a father, a sibling, a caregiver to our families. And at what point do we take that moment to grieve or reflect? And do we feel like we have permission to?
Mhm. I had this thought that occurred to me, Piper. We have somebody who's the head of a very large hospital system involved in our organization. And she said in their unit that was managing a lot of the COVID patients, that normally prior to COVID, they would have 2 deaths in a week. She said during COVID, they were seeing 70 deaths in a week. And she said, how do we support people through something that dramatically different? I mean, like, it changed the composition of everything in their day-to-day practice of care. And, just thinking about how staggering some of those numbers are.
It's devastating. And you see a lot of healthcare workers in general that, they already have that caregiving gene. Just keep going, keep taking on more, keep, give, and not taking that breath to care for themselves. That moral distress just builds and builds and builds. And so I'm really thankful for this time to really expose that and take the stigma out of saying it's okay to grieve, and it's okay to have this breath of, oh my goodness, what have we gone through? And how are we going to get through it?
I want to say too that if you are feeling that way, that you are not at all alone. Normally in our bereavement department here at Casa, we may get 2 or 3 calls a week from community members who say, I really need some bereavement support. I need some grief counseling, or I want to take part in one of your groups. Since the pandemic has been going, probably at about the last summer is when we really saw the change, but we were getting multiple calls a day with that kind of need for help. And so it is something that you are not alone in, that it is real, and that what we find is that you don't necessarily need a professional to help you through it, but oftentimes it's important to just have a listening ear and to take that moment and to admit a little vulnerability. I know I'm lousy at that. I hate admitting when I need help. And I feel like most caregivers, I'm sorry, I'm not a nurse, but I'll say a lot of nurses who are caregivers aren't good necessarily admitting that they need help as well. And so having the strength and the courage to say that opens up the door for others to admit that they need help, and then we can mutually support one another.
Yeah. And there's that piece of just being heard, David, is really important, and by anyone. And to circle back to the permission element you introduced there, Piper, it's, let's say, David, you weren't touched by one of those statistics where you've lost a parent or you haven't lost a grandparent. You've been lucky enough to move out of a more traditional definition of grief, the way our culture has framed it. Everyone's lost a graduation, an anniversary, a birthday, a trip, a family vacation, a trip. There's been so many layers and layers of grief in more behavioral, cultural, sort of non-traditional ways. So if there's one thing we can offer here too, it's just like a blanketed, widespread permission to know that there isn't any one of us that's escaped unscathed here in the grieving process.
Absolutely. Does anybody have anything else they want to add to this question before we move on?
No, I think my only last statement as we look through the next few questions and discussions is a lot of our normal coping mechanisms were taken away from us also. Human contact outside our social bubble Hugs, and I'm not even a hugger, but getting to
Mhm.
hug somebody besides your 7-year-old daughter has been huge as we return to some sort of normalcy. So I just want to point that out as our normal grief coping mechanisms are gone.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's lots of ways that we get comfort, and that physical touch is a huge one that I think many of us have been missing from so many of our members of our support system.
Yeah.
So we want to move on a little bit to an issue that deals with how do we cope with moral distress? And that's a big, big, big term and concept. But I thought back to when the pandemic was beginning, and we did not really know how it was transmitted. We did not know how to protect ourselves. And on top of that, we didn't have the PPE that we needed. And it was scary. I have to admit, I was scared because, and Piper and I had many conversations about that over the time, is that we desperately wanted to protect our staff and knew that we needed to continue to serve the community. We needed to serve our patients and their families because that service was critical at that time. And so it was a matter of what could we do to balance them, and knowing that and I think that many people in the community, whether the acute care setting or skilled nursing facilities or in post-acute care, were having to adjust to what the standard practices were, that we were reusing equipment that normally we wouldn't, that we were having to make equipment that we didn't have. We had volunteers who were making face shields for us, and they absolutely looked homemade. 100% looked homemade, but they were what we needed. So, but it was this anxiety around not being able to provide the care that we know we should be able to because of all the limitations that we were dealing with the pandemic as it was unfolding, and the anxiety that comes with that, and the grief of the loss that we were facing at the same time. So I don't know about you, but I was dealing with a huge amount of stress, and I remember feeling like my go-to, what I wanted to do was to self-medicate, if we're going to be honest. And mine would be to go to having a drink at night afterwards, which I think is fine, but we all have to keep a tab on what that looks like. And I think that what we've seen in the community is that the rate of alcohol consumption turning to other drugs as well has increased. And I don't know if people saw reports recently that it also has gone to the point where we've had a much higher increase in deaths due to overdose in Pima County as well. This all speaks to this kind of distress that we've been experiencing.
Mhm.
Yeah. And that, David, I think you bring up a great point. I love when people, I shouldn't say I love when people ask me, you look so tired. And I'm thinking, I've been tired for like 13 months now. But it's not, all of us, we're not sleeping at night wondering, do we have enough? Are our staff cared for enough? Are our patients cared for enough? I feel bad for our patients that live in long-term care facilities that can't see their families, and the increased death rate around that. And it's hard to find healthy options because the gym's all closed. Not that I was a big gym goer, but the gym's closed, and the restaurants closed, and connections closed. So I'm wondering when we'll turn to normalcy and just get to spend time back that with healthy things besides walking in 100-degree weather, and reconnecting and being able to take that breath. I think we're all ready for a breath.
Yeah. One of my very favorite studies is a study of adult development that was done at Harvard. It's been going on for more than 70 years. And the key finding from that study is that relationships are what matter most in terms of all sorts of things, including longevity and health outcomes. And when you think about how compromised so many relationships have been through this pandemic for all the reasons that you're naming, Piper, like we can't just go to a restaurant and see our friends. For a long time, we've been really confined to things like Zoom and FaceTime, et cetera, and how much that changes our lives. And, you know, what's fascinating is there's data to suggest that can affect our mortality. It can affect the length of our lives and certainly the quality and healthfulness. And so, you know, I love that we're going to kind of conclude today with, so what do you do? You know, how do you find wellness in the midst of all of this? Because none of this is hopeless. It's painful, but it's not hopeless. And so I'm glad that we'll also be, you know, sharing some resources too.
Yeah. And maybe we can kind of shift to the next question, if that feels right. We could say, you know, we've identified so many outlets that have now been altered, you know, these healthy expressive mediums, these natural human functions. And so now we have this kind of pent up emotional experience, all of these biological, social needs kind of stirring in us. And there's a tendency before, and like Shay said, we are going to turn to what is the real-time tools that I already have and how are we going to navigate through this? But right before we turn there, we're going to just address maybe some of the misconceptions about what to do with all of that emotion and all of, you know, the overwhelming amount of information that we're trying to process internally. There's some common trends culturally that are arising, and so I think it'll be nice to just kind of identify those, and then we'll move into some solutions after that. So the first we wanted to touch on was this idea that sort of I have to keep going, that the only way out is to put one foot in front of the next and to carry on with all the same, you know, kind of sentiments. And that kind of like, it reminds me of like a tank, like there, I just gotta, you know, embolden the armor and push on through, but we're humans and we are, and that's our saving grace. And our, like you said, David, our vulnerability is a really important part of us. And so, you know, we'll talk about some ways to kind of deal and kind of move through that, like Shay said, but just if you've had the thought that the only way I can do tomorrow is by doing what I did today, again, you're not alone. A lot of us have been using that as a coping mechanism, but it's one that can certainly tire after a repetitive use. So hopefully we can help just like meet that and transform it a little bit here.
Well, I think one of my biggest misconceptions and positive change that I've seen through this is it's okay to talk about, gosh, this is really hard. Like it doesn't make it harder because you admit that it's hard, and it doesn't make it sadder because you admit that it's sad. And so really starting to open up the dialogue and take away that stigmatism of you shouldn't talk about the bad stuff, or you shouldn't share those feelings, and being able to verbalize and just call David and say, David, this really sucked. And being okay with it in that space that, you know, as Katie points out, I think a lot of us in healthcare just keep thinking, okay, we just got to keep going. We've got to keep going. Be the tank. And everybody needs you. But I really think that one of the blessings from the pandemic has been being able to talk about feelings and share that human connection, even over Zoom or FaceTime. So but it's okay. It's okay to say this is a lot.
Yeah.
We had a session on Zoom for group support for some nurses who were working a skilled nursing facility. And it was amazing because they talked about how hard they worked for 8 months to keep the residents there safe, which meant that they had to cut off all visitation. So the poor residents weren't able to have family members come and visit. But then it also put that huge burden on the staff who were there to be able to be all things to the residents, to be able to provide the medical care, to be the emotional support. They weren't even allowing chaplains in. So being the spiritual support as well for folks. And they talked about the experience of doing that for 8 months only to have someone unknowingly bring the virus in, and a huge portion of their residents died of COVID. And the absolute grief that was felt with that, the frustration of why did we subject them to those months of isolation only to have them die from that which we tried to keep from them. And then that feeling of vulnerability of we can't do what we want to do to protect folks. Those are all so real, and it's important to be able to talk about them openly with our coworkers, to acknowledge that what we do is really hard and what we do is so important.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mm.
I especially, we see it oftentimes in head of a family, head of a team, in leadership roles. I have to carry this strength as to demonstrate what I can carry forward. And what you're saying there, David, that staff had to be all things for all people. They already had a full workload. They already had their own family challenges and their own, community cultural stressors as well. And, this kind of co-ops into another, I think a concept that is really being carried around in our culture right now in a way to celebrate healthcare workers, but can become a burden as well, which is this idea that you are our heroes. You're going to get us out of this. You are impervious to stress or strain, and you keep on marching, and there's a space there where, and Shay, you said this so clearly, like a hero's work is it's a fast job. You are momentarily a hero, but for our entire world to lean on healthcare as our heroes for the last year and a half it's an exhaustible burden. And
well, and not a sustainable model.
Yeah,
it is not a sustainable model. And I think actually healthcare has faced this challenge for many years, right? Because you look at the way we train doctors, you look at the shifts we give nurses. These are extraordinarily taxing. The number of nurses I know that don't pee and don't eat because they are just like on fire during their whole shift. And that is a heck of a lot to ask of a human being. And personally, I don't think long-term a sustainable model. And so I think what we faced with the pandemic was we already had a system that, in my view, had some design flaws in terms of how we were treating and supporting and caring for the human beings within that system that were ripe for improvement, that we were ready to start remodeling and reshaping in more humanistic and thoughtful ways. And then we had this pandemic that pushed hard, in the direction of be the tank, just steamroll through it no matter what. And it's actually the opposite of what I think healthcare needs right now. We need to totally turn the corner in a new direction and say, no, you cannot be a good caregiver if you're not able to first caregive for yourself. And the model of healthcare needs to reflect that all the way through and through the hospital, through hospice, through every one of our systems of medicine. We need to reflect that model of self-care. And, I think this exactly ties into our last piece in terms of the discussion, which is, how are we going to address the aftermath of the pandemic? Everything that we're learning from this experience, the high-level hospital administrators who are telling me, I can't even imagine how much PTSD we're going to see in our staff after this, because we are seeing the signs of that now. And we know this is going to be a reality for the next several years. Like, so many people are saying that to me. So how are we going to address that? What are we going to do with the aftermath? And to me, you can go in a variety of different directions, but one of them could be very positive. we could rethink how we're structuring certain aspects of self-care for the lovely employees who make this all, are the glue that makes healthcare function, like the nurses that are listening to this talk. Like, you are the glue of healthcare in so many ways. So how do we take care of you? How do we sustain you for the next, like you were saying, Piper, for the rest of your career, so that you don't have to drop out and, give up all the hard work you've put into becoming a nurse?
So I think,
what's next?
Shay, your comments bring up this great quote I heard at the beginning of the pandemic, that we have to define a new normal, because the older normal, the prior normal that we just left, wasn't working. So we have this great opportunity to really define a new normal. And on a funny note, David won't eat lunch with me because I still eat like a nurse. So we had lunch the other day and he said, okay, I've had 2 bites and you're done. Slow it down. So how do we retrain our bodies and our mind to really focus on that breath and that time, that space in our new normal?
Yeah, it's building pause, right? There is space. There's a lack of space, right, Piper? There's the space around the human who's holding up the ceiling, the space, like as it's coming crushing down, the weight of the system, the space around a human need to eat and use the restroom that we offer our patients, but yet can't build space for our providers. There's so much. There's a remodeling, like you're saying, Shay, that kind of telescopes up all throughout. It's like the kind of care we want to provide to the patients should be reflecting all the way up into the teams. And to me, this is a point that is really helpful for me in processing large amounts of emotion. But we work, and you all work with your patient communities in this way, where you don't give, like, let's say, my workload is a massive amount of stress on my shoulders, and I can't even really begin to process that I'm going to have to do that day in, day out for the next 6 months. So, because if I start to feel that, I know it's going to be entirely overwhelming and I'm going to shut down. I think it's a common misconception, but it also, we forget the power in medicine that, you build up to large processing capacity by titrating, by moving in small exposure doses, right? We do that with medicine. We do that with large amounts of pain someone's feeling. Can you use enough of a tool to kind of scrape your way through a large experience? And so there's this place of like building in room for the healthcare provider to have a moment to feel 5 minutes of the stress of their day, to feel 10 minutes of the grief of losing 70 patients last week, to kind of just build these powerful small spaces where people move through incremental processing that moves them towards a lighter and more steady, carriage of being that is more, to your point, Shay, sustainable, long-term, where it keeps more of our players in the game.
Kate, I'm really glad you brought that up. It reminds me of Dr. Rachel Raymond talks about there's a difference between practicing good medicine and being good medicine, and that being good medicine and how we are really takes that self-nurturance, that care, that means that it's part of it's a vital part of our own clinical practice to be able to say that self-care, that ability to recognize when things have gone too far and that I can't do anymore, or if I'm the type of person that says, oh yes, I can always do that next thing, to recognize that we all have limits and that there needs to be the space to find that room to grieve, to remember, to honor in the work that we do, that it is, in my world, sacred. And so that we try to carve out that space for our care teams on a regular basis to have a time of storytelling or reflection or meditation that says, this is for us. This is not going to be for others. It's not about what we're doing for others. It's going to be about how we can care for ourselves. And I feel like if we don't carve that out, it doesn't have to be an hour a week. It doesn't have to be, it can be small increments of practice that allows us to say that we too are important. And if we don't do that, we will never practice and be good medicine at the same time.
Mhm. Yeah. And I feel strongly that in the world of wellness, little microdosing of good, healthy wellness habits throughout the day is more powerful than once a week spending 2 hours and, doing an intensive meditation. It's really microdosing. It's really just little bits, small changes that you can make. And we could design a healthcare system that creates those micro moments, that's very conscious and has a very intelligent design. And how beautiful could that be? Because, one of the studies we showed on the slides is that if your physical and mental health are compromised as a nurse, you create more medical errors. That has direct impact on your patients and their well-being, and in some cases, whether they live or die. So this really matters. And so in some ways, I'm grateful that this incredibly hard situation that we're all in with the pandemic has opened up the possibility for a recreation of a new future, and to really bring these ideas of self-care and wellness into our systems of medicine, because they're truly a necessity. Yeah. So I think, that's kind of a nice spot for us to shift into the next section of our dialogue today, which is to specifically provide some wellness resources. So we've kind of collectively summarized some tools that we think could be helpful to everyone. And so Katie's going to start to show those. One is, so our organization, Integrative Touch for Kids, at the URL at the bottom of this slide, we saw at the beginning of the pandemic that so many people needed support. And so we created a page on our website, at this URL, that has all sorts of different categories of wellness resources. So things like mindfulness tools, meditation, art, fun things, breathing techniques, emotional support. There's a whole collection of apps that you can use to sustain wellness. So it's a great starting point. There's no money. We just gathered as much as we could. We found free resources that wouldn't cost you anything that could help you. So it's basically a gift to the community to just try to support you during this very difficult time. So that's the first one we wanted to share. And then we also, again, just motivated by the need, we created a podcast that's called Conversations on Healing. That's on, you can get on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and also at this URL that's listed at the bottom, that we basically have nationally and internationally wellness experts who come on and talk about a variety of different topics. So one might talk about healthy eating. We just had Judson Brewer, MD, PhD, come on and talk about unwinding anxiety. We have Kristen Neff is going to come on and talk about self-compassion. I had Daniel Goleman, God, that was amazing, come on and talk about emotional intelligence. So there's some incredible thought leaders that are discussing, how do we heal? How do we stay well in these hard times? And then Katie's going to introduce us to some other offerings that we have.
Yeah, so our telewellness program is something we built specifically to, pre-pandemic, we were in the hospital treating patients and tracking on their staff who were carrying the stress and the burden of care. And, in COVID, we thought, how do we still reach people exactly where they're at? We began a beautiful new program that is offered in a 10-week series, where we meet with our recipients who are folks in any form of healthcare. And we meet with them for about 90 minutes a week at a repeating appointment time. We present on different integrative wellness topics and content. And then we match our recipients with a team of integrative wellness providers. We have folks trained in Eastern medicine. We have trauma-based, addiction-based counseling folks. We have many forms of body workers and biofield therapists, and a lot of traditional healing arts providers as well. And our our cross-trained team, what they do is once we present the basics and the core concepts in a certain sector of integrative wellness, our team then really meets with 1 or 2 recipients and helps them over those 10 weeks. They do an hour a week direct care with the team, where you really work to customize those tools. Okay, we take the tool right off the rack, but how does it fit into your life? How do we custom tailor it to your specific needs, your family, the structure of your day, and the composition of your stress? I believe this really reflects back onto Shay, the research study you mentioned about relationships being really a heavy indicator of health outcomes and longevity. And something beautiful about this tele-wellness program is we actually help you, we bring you back into a greater relationship with yourself. Our team is able to sit, provide that listening you offered as a value, David, that the validation you were offering, Piper, and really say, okay, how do we learn inside of you when that stress is feeling too much? What does that look like in your story? Where does that look like in your body? How do we build up all the resources and just the available bite-size microdose of wellness right around you in your network? So it's on your side. These are just some of the topics we cover in the course. It's nice to just briefly look at the scope and the range of the content material. I will say this course is offered. We are currently accepting applications, and if you're watching this later in time, we are accepting rolling applications. So we're always open to receive inquiries. Our series, like I said, are 10 weeks, and we're offering them about 4 times a year, if not more these days. And we do have many scholarships available for this program. To date, I think we've offered something like over $100,000 to healthcare providers and community members in need for receiving this type of care. And so this is our website here at integrativetouch.org. That's where you can kind of navigate yourself through many of those resources we just shared. And we wanted to also put up some other great organizations in the work that they are doing. We have the Apaya Center, the Zen Center out of New Mexico, their work around grief and caregiving and meditative and just more present awareness and being in healthcare. We also have the Zen Caregiver Project. They are lovely. They're out of California, and they have a lot of workshops and resources available right there on their website that you can watch in real time. Yeah.
Fabulous. Well, I think that brings us to a close. Are there any closing comments that David or Piper you'd like to add?
Anybody else?
David, you're always the best closer. So.
Right. Bring us to a close, David.
All right. I want to begin by saying how grateful that Piper and I are to both Shay and Katie for this collaborative experience right now, to have this conversation. It's been wonderful to work with Integrative Touch for Kids and to get your expertise in what it means to care for ourselves and your work with clinicians throughout our community. And that I've been so impressed with the support that you've been able to offer clinicians throughout this time, even in a remote setting, and making it available and affordable to folks. So thank you so much for that. We at Casa de la Luz are so happy to be able to collaborate with you on this. And we're grateful to everybody who was able to watch this. We are deeply humbled by your work. We celebrate you in the most respectful way. And that one of the things that Katie put up there in terms of Integrative Touch for Kids and the tools that they're hoping to build for practitioners has to do with resilience. And when you are feeling as if you're at the end of your rope, I want you to remember that you are resilient. What we have been reminded of again and again and again is that we have the capacity to find the resources and the space and the people who can help sustain us until we can catch our breath and go again. But you are so needed. We are so appreciative of everything that you have done, and that if we can be of support to you moving forward, as you grow in your career, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. So thank you all so much.
Beautiful. Thank you, David.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, nurses.
Thank you, nurses.